The blood hit the floor before anyone could react. A Navy SEAL, 26 years old, built like iron, trained to survive things that would kill ordinary men, was dying on a gurney in the middle of Harlow Regional Medical Center's emergency room. His chest was caving in from the inside. A four-star Admiral stood at the entrance, voice cutting through every alarm in the building, demanding the finest cardiac surgeon in Harlow City. Security guards scrambled, doctors froze. Nurses pressed themselves against the walls. Then the double door swung open, and a blonde woman in scrubs walked through like she had all the time in the world. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Admiral looked at her, and his face went white. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that follow button right now, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The call had come in at 11:47 p.m. Harlow Regional Medical Center had been running a full house since 9. A 4-car pileup on the interstate, 2 stab wounds from a bar fight on Delancey Street, and a diabetic crash that had backed the triage desk up for 40 minutes. The ER was the kind of controlled disaster that looked like chaos to anyone who didn't live inside it every day. Nurse practitioner Dara Finch was managing the board when the radio crackled with the incoming critical trauma, male, mid-20s, blunt force to the chest sustained during a training exercise at the Kellerman Naval Base 12 miles east of the city. Possible cardiac tamponade. ETA 6 minutes. Somebody find Okafor, Dara said, not looking up from the board. And get me a crash cart in Bay 4. Okafor's elbow deep in the chest guy from the pileup, said Marcus, one of the ER techs already moving. Then find somebody who isn't. Dara pressed her earpiece. Where's Lentz, Lentz left at 11. His daughter's sick. Dara exhaled through her nose. She pulled up the on-call roster on the tablet, scrolled through it twice, and said nothing that was appropriate to say out loud. That was when the side door opened and Mara Weston walked in. She was the kind of woman people looked at and immediately filed away as unremarkable. Not because she was, but because she didn't do anything to make herself easy to notice. Average height, blonde hair pulled back tight, dark circles she'd stopped trying to hide 2 years ago. She moved through spaces the way water moved through pipes, efficiently, without friction, finding the path of least resistance, not because she was passive, but because she was always calculating exactly where she needed to be. She was halfway through a 12-hour shift that had already become 14. She'd eaten half a granola bar at 8 p.m. She had a cold she was ignoring. Weston, Dara said without turning around. Bay 4, incoming critical. I heard. Mara was already tying her gloves. Cardiac tamponade presentation. They're calling it possible. It's not possible, Mara said. The mechanism they described on the radio? It's definite. Get the pericardiocentesis kit pulled and ready. Dara finally looked up. She studied Mara for a second, the way she always did when Mara said something that sounded too certain to be casual. You want to maybe wait until he gets here first? Sure, Mara said. Have the kit ready anyway. She was already walking toward Bay 4. The ambulance doors blew open at 11:53. The paramedics came through fast, 2 of them working the gurney, both talking at the same time, layering information over each other in that breathless relay that meant they'd been working the patient hard the whole drive-in. The SEAL's name was Garrett Voss. 26. Elite operator, 4 years of service, currently assigned to DevGrew's East Coast training rotation at Kellerman. He'd taken a steel training rod to the sternum during a controlled environment exercise, something that should have left a bruise, maybe a cracked rib, nothing more. Instead, the impact had torn a small vessel near his pericardium, and the resulting bleed had spent the last 22 minutes quietly filling the sac around his heart. His pressure was collapsing. His heart sounds were muffled. He was still conscious, barely. And that was the part that was almost cruel, because it meant he knew what was happening to him. Hey, Mara said, stepping up beside the gurney. Garrett, I'm Mara. Look at me. His eyes found her face. They were glassy and too wide, the kind of eyes that were working hard to stay focused on something, anything, just to hold on. You've got blood around your heart, she told him, straightforward, no sugarcoating. We're going to fix that right now. You're going to feel a lot of pressure. Don't fight it. Is it? He couldn't finish the sentence. It's fixable, she said. Stop talking. She turned to the tech. Kit. That was when the double doors at the far end of the ER crashed open. Rear Admiral Desmond Voss walked into Harlow Regional Medical Center like he owned it, which in several important ways he believed he did, given that he sat on the civilian oversight board for the base's medical contractor network and had personally approved the hospital's trauma designation renewal 2 years prior. He was 61 years old, 6'2", silver-haired, and built like someone had constructed a man specifically to give orders and have them followed. Behind him came 2 Navy lieutenants and a woman in a civilian suit who appeared to be someone's administrative assistant and was frantically typing on a phone. He spotted the gurney before the nurse's station. He spotted his son. "Garrett." His voice dropped. Not soft, exactly, but compressed, the way a man compresses every feeling he has into something that sounds controlled because the alternative is falling apart in public. He moved toward the gurney and Mara stepped sideways, not retreating, just repositioning, continuing to work. "Sir, I need you to—" "I am Rear Admiral Desmond Voss, and that is my son." He said it like a legal argument. "Where is the attending physician? Who is the chief of surgery on call tonight?" "Dr. Okafor is currently in an active procedure," Dara said, appearing at his elbow with the practiced calm of someone who had handled very difficult family members in very high-stress situations many times before. "We have Dr. Pemberton on call for—" "Pemberton is a general surgeon," the Admiral said. "My son needs a cardiac surgeon. Get me a cardiac surgeon. Sir, your son's immediate issue is, get me a cardiac surgeon." He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to shout. The words landed like something physical. Dara looked at Mara. Mara had the pericardiocentesis kit open. "What is she doing?" the Admiral said. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. "She's saving your son's life," Dara said quietly. The Admiral looked at the blonde nurse with the gloved hands and the calm face and the needle that was approximately the length of a nightmare, and something moved behind his eyes. It wasn't recognition. Not yet. It was something more instinctive, a wrongness, a familiarity he couldn't place the way you can't place a smell from 20 years ago until something else triggers the memory. "Step away from my son," he said. "I want someone qualified." Mara didn't look up. Garrett's pericardial sac has been filling for approximately 25 minutes. At the current rate, he has 3 to 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. Dr. Pemberton is 17 minutes out. A cardiac surgeon is 45. I need to drain this now, and I need you to stop talking. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. "You do not give orders to—" "Admiral." Mara finally looked at him. Her eyes were dark and absolutely still. "With respect, I've done this procedure 14 times. 11 of those were in active combat conditions with less equipment than I'm holding right now. Your son is going to die if I don't start in the next 90 seconds. You can stand over there and watch, or you can go wait in the family room. But you do not get a third option." Nobody moved. The heart monitor flatlined for 2 seconds, then reset. A warning, not a failure, but close enough. Mara turned back to Garrett. "Garrett, exhale slowly. This is going to hurt us." She found the angle by feel as much as by anatomy. That was the part nobody talked about with pericardiocentesis. The textbook made it look geometric, precise, a clean line from needle to effusion. The reality was that every patient was slightly different, that the pericardial sac sat at a unique angle in every chest, and that doing it right required a kind of three-dimensional understanding of the body that came from having done it enough times that your hands knew before your brain finished calculating. Mara's hands knew. She advanced the needle slow and steady, watching the monitor, watching Garrett's face, feeling for the change in resistance that meant she'd reached the right depth. The room had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of people who were watching something they didn't fully understand and were afraid to breathe in case they disrupted it. The Admiral had not moved to the family room. He stood 6 feet away, jaw set, hands at his sides, watching a nurse do something that looked impossible with the steady grip and unhurried precision of a surgeon who had done it 1,000 times. The first draw came back dark red. "That's it," Marcus said under his breath. Mara aspirated slowly, 10 cubic centimeters, 20. The heart monitor, which had been trending toward an alarm for the past 4 minutes, began to normalize. Garrett's blood pressure, which had been dropping in increments that made everyone in the room quietly terrified, started climbing back. 40 cubic centimeters. Garrett exhaled. A full breath, the first real one he'd managed in 20 minutes. And something in his face changed. The glassy, faraway look receded. He blinked. He focused. He stopped. That's better. Don't talk, Mara said. We're not finished. She kept drawing. 60 cubic centimeters total before she was satisfied the pressure had equalized enough to be stable. She taped the catheter in place, stepped back, stripped her outer gloves, and began calling out the post-procedure orders to Marcus and the second tech in a flat, methodical voice. Labs, imaging, surgical consult, monitor parameters, the things that needed to happen in the next 15 minutes to make sure this held. It was only then that she allowed herself to look at the Admiral again. He was staring at her. Not with gratitude. That would come later, maybe, or maybe not at all. What was on his face right now was something harder to name. He was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't belong in the category you put it in. A small animal that turns out to have teeth. A stranger whose walk you recognize. Who are you? He said, quietly this time. Mara Weston, she said. ER nurse practitioner. That's not what I'm asking. She held his gaze for a second. Then she turned back to Garrett's chart and started documenting. Dr. Pemberton arrived at 12:21 a.m., assessed the situation in 90 seconds, and declared Garrett stable enough for transport to the cardiac ICU, pending a surgical consult in the morning. He reviewed Mara's procedure notes, reviewed the imaging Marcus had pulled, and said, to nobody in particular, clean as a textbook. Then he left to check on his other cases. Mara was at the documentation station when she heard the footsteps. She didn't need to look up. The procedure you performed, Admiral Voss said. Nurses aren't authorized to perform pericardiocentesis outside a physician-supervised code scenario. I'm aware, Mara said, still writing. You could face disciplinary action. I know. You're not concerned. She stopped writing. She set down her pen. She looked at him. Really looked at him, the way she'd been avoiding doing since he walked in, because she'd recognized him the moment he came through those doors, and she'd needed both hands and all of her concentration for the last 40 minutes, and she could not afford what recognizing him would cost her right now. Your son is alive, she said. I'll deal with whatever comes next. Something shifted in his expression. He leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, more like a man trying to bring something blurry into focus. I know your face, he said. You don't, she said. She picked up her pen. Your eyes, he said. I've seen eyes like that. Combat. The flat kind. The kind you get when you've made decisions. He stopped. He was working through something, and she could see the exact moment the calculation landed. His face changed. Not dramatically. He was too disciplined for that. But the color shifted, and his jaw tightened, and he went very still the way men go still when something they didn't expect hits them. Kandahar, he said. 2019. Mara said nothing. You were with the 75th Support Brigade's forward surgical element. It wasn't a question anymore. You were the medic on the Korengal extraction. The nurses' station around them had gone quiet. Marcus was pretending to look at something on a tablet. Dara had appeared in the doorway of the medication room and stopped moving. My name is Mara Weston, she said evenly. I'm an ER nurse at Harlow Regional. If you have concerns about my clinical competency, you can speak with the department director in the morning. You went by a different name. She kept her eyes on the chart. Stanhope, he said. Sergeant First Class Lauren Stanhope. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone in still water. Mara finished her sentence in the chart, capped her pen, and stood up. Garrett needs to rest, she said. You should be with him. She gathered the files and walked toward the back corridor without hurrying, without looking back, without giving him anything else to read. But her hands, her very steady, very capable hands, were not entirely steady anymore. Because Rear Admiral Desmond Voss had just said a name she had spent 5 years burying in a hospital where nobody knew it, in a city where she was supposed to be invisible.
and from the look on his face when he said it, he hadn't forgotten a single thing about the night that name had last mattered, or who he believed was responsible for what happened to his closest friend. The back corridor of Harlow Regional at 12:30 a.m. was the ugliest part of the building, fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly off frequency, linoleum that had been cleaned so many times the pattern had worn through to bare gray underneath, a row of supply carts nobody had restocked since Tuesday. Mara walked it fast, not running, controlling her breathing the way she'd been trained to control it in situations where running would give too much away. She pushed through the door to the staff locker room, let it close behind her, and stood in the silence for exactly 4 seconds. Then she sat down on the bench and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They took longer than she liked. The name. He'd said the name out loud in the middle of a busy ER, in front of nurses and techs who would go home in a few hours and talk to their partners and their friends. Stanhope. She hadn't heard it spoken in 5 years, not since the day she'd signed the separation papers, cleared her locker at Fort Delvey, and driven west until Harlow felt like far enough. She'd rebuilt everything. New state, new credentials under her legal middle name, new employment history that was factually accurate and strategically incomplete. She hadn't hidden. She'd just stopped being visible. Desmond Voss had walked through a door and undone 5 years of quiet in about 30 seconds. She stood up, opened her locker, and stared at nothing for a moment. Then she closed it without taking anything out and went back to work. Because there were still 4 hours left in her shift and 3 patients who needed her, and falling apart was a thing she could do later, at home, alone, where it wouldn't cost anyone anything. So she managed 40 minutes before Dara found her. Dara Finch was 44 years old, had been running ER nursing teams for 11 of those years, and had a talent for reading people that she'd never formally cultivated, but that showed up reliably in the way she always seemed to be standing in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She appeared next to Mara at the medication cabinet with 2 coffees from the break room vending machine and the particular expression of someone who wasn't going to pretend they hadn't just witnessed something significant. She handed Mara a coffee without saying anything. Mara took it. "Don't. I'm not doing anything. You've got your face on." "I have a lot of faces." Dara leaned against the cabinet. "That was what you did in Bay 4. That was something else." "It was a standard procedure." "Not for an NP in a civilian ER at midnight, it wasn't." Dara kept her voice neutral. "The Admiral. He knew you. He thought he did." "Did he?" Mara drank the coffee. It was bad, burnt, thin, the kind that tastes like the machine hasn't been cleaned since the last administration. She drank it anyway. "I need to check on the Delancey Street guy." "Marcus has him." Dara didn't move. "Mara, whatever that was, if it's going to come back on you, I need to know so I can figure out how to help." It was a generous offer, and it landed with all the weight of something Mara didn't entirely know how to accept. She looked at Dara for a second, calculating, not strategically, just honestly, the way you look at someone when you're trying to decide how much of yourself is safe to hand them. "It's old," she said finally. "It's got nothing to do with tonight." The Admiral didn't look like a man who thinks it's got nothing to do with tonight. "No," Mara agreed. "He doesn't." She set down the coffee and walked away, and Dara let her go, which was the right call, and also probably the thing Mara would think about later at 2 in the morning when she couldn't sleep. She finished her shift at 3 a.m. and drove home through streets that were empty in the particular way of a mid-sized city after midnight. Not abandoned, just resting, a few lights on in upper windows. A delivery truck idling outside a restaurant, the ordinary evidence of a world that kept running underneath the hours when most people weren't watching. Her apartment was a second-floor unit in a building on Crestfall Avenue that she'd chosen specifically because it had 2 staircases and a parking garage that connected to an adjacent building. She'd told herself at the time that she chose it for the price. She'd known, even then, that wasn't the whole truth. She didn't turn on the lights right away. She stood in the dark kitchen for a minute, coat still on, keys in her hand, letting her eyes adjust. The framed photo on the kitchen shelf was the only military thing she'd kept. Not a unit photo, not anything that would identify the circumstances. Just a photograph.
3 people standing in front of a Black Hawk, laughing at something off camera, dust on everything, the light the flat white of somewhere very hot and very far from here. She was on the left, younger, with shorter hair and a laugh she didn't recognize in her own face anymore. The man in the middle was tall and lean, with a wide grin and a coffee cup in his hand. His name had been Captain Miles Rafferty. He had been Desmond Voss's closest friend since the Naval Academy, which Mara had only learned later, after everything. She turned the photo face down, not because she was ashamed of it, but because she'd been doing that for 5 years, and some habits outlasted their original reasons. She made herself eat something, crackers, an apple, the last of a block of cheddar that was a day past its best date, and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what Admiral Voss had looked like when he said the name, the way it had come out of him. Not triumphant, not accusatory. More like a man who'd been carrying a question for 5 years and had suddenly found the answer in an emergency room at midnight while his son was being kept alive by the very person the question was about. She'd spent 5 years being relatively certain he would never find her. Not because she'd been so careful, but because powerful men with long grudges generally had more satisfying targets to pursue. She'd been wrong about that, apparently, or at least the timeline had been wrong. She went to bed at 4 and didn't sleep until 5, and was back at the hospital at 6:30 for a meeting that had nothing to do with any of this. The meeting was about billing codes. 45 minutes of billing codes, in a conference room with bad chairs and a projector that kept losing signal, and Mara sat in the back and contributed 2 factual corrections and thought about other things. When it ended, she walked the long way around to the CICU. Not because she was supposed to, not because Garrett Voss was technically her patient anymore, but because she'd put a catheter in the man's pericardium at midnight, and she wanted to know how he was doing. He was awake. He looked like he'd been through something significant, which he had, but his color was better and he was sitting up at about 30 degrees and tracking the room with the alert, assessing eyes of someone whose body had been through the worst of it and whose brain had now caught up. He saw her before she'd fully stepped through the door. "Hey," he said, "you're the one who... last night." Mara Weston, from the ER. She stopped at a professional distance. "I wanted to check your chart. I'm not your care team up here." Dr. Aguilar was in this morning. Garrett shifted slightly and winced, not dramatically, just the involuntary acknowledgement of someone who'd learned exactly which movements cost something. She said the procedure last night was well done. Good. She also said I was about 2 minutes out. Mara looked at his chart rather than at him. It was close. Yeah. He was quiet for a second. My dad was here until 4. He didn't say much when he left. She kept her eyes on the chart numbers. Everything looked appropriate. Pressure normalized, no recurrence, surgical review scheduled for later in the day. He knows you, Garrett said, not asking. He thinks he does. He said your name, not the one you told me, the other one. I was kind of in and out, but I heard it. He paused. He looked scared. That surprised her. She looked up without meaning to. Garrett met her gaze steadily. He had his father's eyes, same shape, different temperature. The father's eyes were the kind that assessed everything as either a problem or a resource. Garrett's just looked at things. My dad doesn't scare easy, he said. Whatever you two have going on, he was scared. He was worried about you, Mara said. She set the chart back in its holder. You should rest. The surgical team will be in this afternoon. She was at the door when he said, He's coming back this morning. I figured you should know. She didn't turn around. Thanks. Thus, she was in the break room with 15 minutes before her shift technically started, putting together a lunch she probably wouldn't eat, when her phone buzzed with an internal message from the department director's assistant. Dr. Halverson would like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. His schedule has a window at 10 a.m. She stared at it for a second. Earliest convenience was the administrative way of saying this is not optional. A 10 a.m. window on a Monday was the administrative way of saying we've been working on this since before you arrived. She typed back that 10 a.m. worked and put her phone away. She had 3 hours. She spent them doing her job. She had 2 post-op checks, a chest pain workup that turned out to be a panic attack, and a 43-year-old accountant named Patrick, who was very embarrassed about it and whom Mara sat with for a few extra minutes because embarrassed people with chest pain sometimes had chest pain, and a consult for a pediatric case that had come up from the overnight. She was good at her job. She had been good at it for 5 years in this building, working the kind of hours that burned people out and staying longer than anyone asked, and she knew the rhythms of Harlow Regional the way she'd once known the rhythms of a forward operating base. Not because the situations were comparable, but because the underlying skill was the same. Understanding a system well enough to function in it effectively when the system started to break down. At 9:58, she walked to the administrative wing. Dr. Halverson's office had a window that looked out on the parking structure, which seemed like a design failure, but which he'd told her once he preferred because it meant he could see who was coming and going. He was 53, balding in a way he'd made peace with, and had run Harlow Regional's emergency department for 9 years. He was not a bad man. He was a man who operated inside constraints, budgetary, regulatory, political, and who had learned to make decisions that protected the institution first, because that was the only way the institution survived to keep doing any good at all. He was already on his second coffee when she came in. There was another person in the room, a woman Mara didn't recognize, 50s, in a suit that said legal or compliance without her needing to introduce herself. Mara. Halverson gestured to the chair across from his desk. Thanks for coming in. This is Bet Sorrell from the hospital's legal affairs office. Mara sat down. You know why you're here, Halverson said. The pericardiocentesis. The unsupervised pericardiocentesis performed by a nurse practitioner in an emergency room without direct physician oversight, Sorrell said. She had a legal pad and a pen and the manner of someone who was building a record in real time. Yes. The patient was in immediate cardiac arrest risk, Mara said. The time to physician arrival exceeded the patient's survival window. I've documented everything. We've seen your documentation, Halverson said. It's thorough. It's also an admission of a protocol violation, Sorrell said. Regardless of outcome, the procedure you performed falls outside your authorized scope of practice under your current NP licensure classification in this state. I know. Then you understand the exposure this creates for the hospital. I understand, Mara said, that Garrett Voss would have died in Bay 4. Sorrell made a note. We're not questioning the outcome. Then what? We're questioning the precedent. Sorrell set down her pen. If we allow this to go undisciplined, we are effectively communicating to our nursing staff that solo high-risk procedures are acceptable in time-critical situations. That is not a standard we can establish. Mara looked at Halverson. Halverson was looking at his coffee cup. There will need to be a formal review, he said. Protocol Review Committee. Your credentials go on hold pending. My credentials. She kept her voice flat. It's standard in situations like, I've been here 5 years, she said. 11-hour shifts, full house, 3 nurses short every weekend from March to September. I have covered gaps in this department that your roster doesn't even officially acknowledge. And a man is alive this morning because of a call I made that I would make again. I know, Halverson said, and he sounded tired in a way that was real, not performed. Mara, I know, but my hands aren't entirely— Whose are? She said. He didn't answer that. Sorrell gathered her legal pad. The review committee convenes Thursday. Until then, your floor privileges are limited to supervised practice. You'll be notified formally by end of day. Mara stood. She smoothed the front of her scrubs. A small, automatic gesture. Is that everything? For now, Sorrell said. Mara walked out. The hallway outside Halverson's office was empty. She stood in it for a moment, weight back against the wall, looking at the ceiling. Supervised practice. It meant she'd have a physician physically present or on direct call for any procedure above a basic threshold. It meant that every call she made in the next however many weeks would be second-guessed in real time by someone who hadn't been there when the original call was made. It wasn't suspension. It was something more insidious. A constraint designed to make her feel the weight of the institution's disapproval without the clean finality of an actual consequence she could fight. She'd spent 5 years being methodically excellent at this job, and inside of 8 hours, a man she'd spent years not thinking about had walked through a set of double doors, and the whole careful structure of her civilian life had started developing cracks. She pushed off the wall and went back to work. She didn't see the Admiral until 2 p.m. He was in the corridor outside the CICU, alone. The lieutenants and the assistant were gone, which made him look simultaneously more human and more dangerous, the way powerful people always seem slightly more themselves without their retinue. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia. He looked like he hadn't slept. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither of them pretended otherwise. "Miss Weston," he said. She almost corrected him. The name difference was irrelevant now, but stopped herself. Let him choose what to call her. Let him work through whatever this was on his own schedule. "How's Garrett?" she said. "Better. The surgeon says he might avoid a full repair if the bleed stays controlled." He paused. "Because of what you did." "Okay." He looked at her with an expression that was working to stay contained. "I heard about the review. Halverson's office." She said nothing. "I have some influence with the hospital's oversight structure," he said. "I could—" "Don't!" She said it without heat. "I don't want anything from you. I did my job." Something in his jaw tightened. "I came on strongly last night. In the ER. I was—" He stopped. Started again. "I was looking at my son dying, and then I saw your face and You reacted," she said. "I understand." "You understood 5 years ago, too," he said. "Which is what I keep coming back to." There it was. She'd been waiting for it. The pivot from the present to the thing underneath it. She looked at him steadily. "I want to talk about Kandahar," he said. "This isn't the place." "Name a place." She thought about declining. She thought about several different versions of declining, in fact. Firm, polite, evasive, bureaucratic. She'd been declining this conversation for 5 years in her head. She knew all the arguments, had rehearsed all the deflections. "There's a coffee place on Meridian Street," she said. "The Grey Cup, 6 o'clock. He nodded. She walked past him toward the elevator, and she was almost to it when his voice came after her. Quieter this time, almost like he wasn't sure he should say it. "Stanhope." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "I've been carrying a version of what happened that night for 5 years," he said. "I need to know if it's the right one." She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. "Bring the file," she said, "if you still have it." The doors closed. She rode down 3 floors alone, looking at her own reflection in the metal doors, and thought about Miles Rafferty, laughing at something off camera in a photograph she'd turned face down the night before. His wide grin, the coffee cup in his hand, the light flat and white behind him. The way he'd looked about 30 seconds before the world they were all standing in went entirely wrong. She'd kept her silence about that night because he'd asked her to, because in the last coherent minutes of his life, he'd given her a direct order, and she had followed it the way she'd followed every order he'd ever given her, and she had never, not once in 5 years, questioned whether following it had been the right thing. She was beginning to now. The elevator opened on the ground floor, and a woman in a wheelchair and a man pushing her both moved to get in, and Mara stepped out and held the door and smiled at them briefly, automatically. The professional smile, the one that meant nothing and cost nothing and gave nothing away. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, with a 703 area code, Northern Virginia, where the Pentagon sat. It said, "Sergeant Stanhope. This is Colonel Anita Dreschler, JAG Corps. Don't meet with Admiral Voss until you've spoken with me. There are things about the Kandahar file you don't know. Call me." Mara read it twice. Then she looked up at the lobby around her. The ordinary afternoon business of a hospital, people coming in and going out, someone at the information desk, a child in a winter coat too big for her running toward the exit while her parent called after her. And she felt, for the first time in 5 years, the ground shifting in a way she had not prepared for. She called Dreschler from her car. The parking garage was 3 levels below the hospital, which meant no signal, so she'd driven up the ramp to the street exit and pulled into a loading zone with the hazards on. And she sat there with the engine running and the heat going and the phone pressed against her ear while the city moved around her in the ordinary way of cities in the middle of a weekday afternoon. It rang 4 times before a woman picked up. "Dreschler?" "This is Mara Weston," she said. You texted me. A pause. Not hesitation, more like someone relocating their attention from one thing to another. Ms. Weston, thank you for calling quickly. I'm going to ask you something before we go further. Are you currently in a private location? Private enough? The parking structure at Harlow Regional is not monitored by us, so that's fine. I'll keep this brief. Another pause, and then, the Kandahar extraction file, the formal record from the 2019 operation. Are you aware that it was amended after your discharge? Mara's hand tightened around the phone. Amended how? Sections were reclassified, not redacted, reclassified under a different authority level, which effectively buried them from the standard inquiry trail. The version that Admiral Voss has seen, the version he has been operating from for 5 years, is not the complete file. Outside the windshield, a man in a delivery uniform was loading boxes from a truck onto a dolly, working fast against the cold. Mara watched him without seeing him. What's in the sections he hasn't seen, she said. Captain Rafferty's final communications, including the verbal orders he gave to you in the last 18 minutes of the operation. Dreschler's voice was precise and careful, the voice of someone who had thought through every word before placing this call. And a secondary report submitted by Corpsman Aldrich Neves, who was also present on extraction, which corroborates your account of the triage decision in detail. Neves. She hadn't heard that name in 5 years either. He'd been 22 years old and from somewhere in Louisiana, and he'd had shrapnel in his left shoulder for the last 40 minutes of that operation, and he'd still managed to help her with the IV lines. She hadn't known he'd submitted anything. Why is it coming out now? She said. Because Admiral Voss is in Harlow, Dreschler said. And because when a 4-star's son is admitted to a hospital and the attending medical professional turns out to be the subject of an unresolved grievance, certain people in certain offices start paying attention to things they'd been comfortable leaving buried. A beat. There are individuals who benefit from the current version of the record remaining the official one. The amendment didn't happen by accident. Who ordered it? That's what we're working on. Dreschler's tone didn't shift. Still precise. Still careful. Ms. Weston, I need you to not meet with Admiral Voss tonight. Not because I think he's dangerous to you personally, but because if he confronts you before we've been able to bring him the full record, you're going to have a conversation that starts from an incomplete foundation. And whatever understanding you two reach will be built on incomplete information. That won't serve either of you. I told him 6 o'clock. I know, we've been monitoring his communications. She said it without apology. Cancel it. I'll have the complete file to you within 48 hours. Then you can have whatever conversation you need to have. Mara looked at the time on the dashboard. 2:26 p.m. I'll think about it, she said. Ms. Weston, I'll think about it, she said again, and ended the call. She sat in the loading zone for another 4 minutes. A city parking officer appeared at the edge of her vision, noticed her hazards, made a note, and kept walking. She had maybe 2 more minutes before that became a conversation she didn't want. She pulled back into the garage, parked, and walked up to the hospital with her hands in her coat pockets, and her mind working in the way it worked when she had too many variables and not enough reliable information, narrowing, discarding, prioritizing. Someone had amended the file, not redacted, reclassified, which was a different kind of disappearing, one that required authorization and left a trail even if the trail was deliberately obscured. That meant someone with access and authority had specifically chosen to ensure that Desmond Voss spent 5 years looking at a version of events that cut out the parts that would have exonerated her. The question of who and why sat in her chest like a weight she didn't have time to examine right now. She had a shift to finish. What? The shift finished at 7, which meant she missed the 6 p.m. meeting by default rather than by decision, and she spent the drive home trying to decide how she felt about that. Relieved, mostly. A little like she'd postponed something inevitable rather than avoided it. She'd sent a text to the number the Admiral had given Dara, a brief, factual message saying something had come up at work and she needed to reschedule. He'd replied, "Understood. Tomorrow." Just those 2 words, which told her almost nothing except that he was someone accustomed to getting things on his own timeline. She ate a real dinner for once, scrambled eggs, toast, the last of the cheese, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, pulling up everything she could find in the public domain about the 2019 Kandahar extraction. There wasn't much. There never was, with operations at that classification level. A few oblique references in publicly available after-action summaries, language scrubbed to the point of meaning nothing. A commendation citation for the unit that she already knew about. Miles Rafferty's obituary on a military memorial site, which she had read so many times she could have recited it from memory, and which said nothing about how he died except in service to his country, which was accurate and also entirely beside the point. She closed the laptop at 10 and went to bed and slept. Not well, but solidly enough, which was what her body needed. She was back at the hospital at 6:30. The call came in at 8:14 a.m. She was in the middle of a medication review when the overhead tone went, and she heard the code before the words finished, mass casualty event, which in Harlow's ER meant a specific protocol, a specific reorganization of resources, a specific mental shift from managing individual patients to managing a population of patients with a triage logic that was different in kind from ordinary emergency medicine. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "Kellerman," he said, "training exercise gone wrong, gas line failure in one of the facilities, multiple blast injuries and burns, minimum 12 incoming, possibly more." Kellerman Naval Base, where Garrett Voss had been training when he got hurt. "How far out?" she said. "First wave 8 minutes, second wave maybe 20. Dara was already at the board reorganizing. The ER's minor complaint cases were being redirected, the trauma bays cleared and restocked, additional staff pulled from the floors. Mara went to her station and started pulling what she'd need for blast injury presentations. The specific cascade of problems that came with explosive concussion events, which were different from blunt trauma in ways that took experience to manage correctly. Burns, blast lung, tympanic rupture, penetrating fragment wounds, crush injuries. The full suite. She had seen every one of them before. Not here, not in this building. But the hands that had managed them before were the same hands she was pulling her gloves onto right now, and muscle memory was a thing that didn't care about the 5 years in between. The first ambulances arrived at 8:22. 12 patients in the first wave, which was 2 more than the initial call, and they ranged from walking wounded with fragment lacerations and ruptured eardrums to 2 critical burns and a blast lung case that went directly to the most experienced team available, which in the immediate calculus of the next 10 minutes turned out to include Mara. His name was Petty Officer 2nd Class Roy Hamada, 24 years old, and the blast overpressure from the gas line failure had done something specific and brutal to his pulmonary system. The alveoli in both lungs disrupted, the capillary beds damaged, the resulting condition presenting as a slow suffocation that looked deceptively manageable in the first 20 minutes and became rapidly lethal if you missed the window. "He's maintaining SATs," said the resident, a second-year named Pharaoh who was good and knew it, which sometimes helped and sometimes got in the way. "Low 80s, but low 80s is not maintaining," Mara said. She was looking at the chest imaging on the portable viewer. "That's a tension pneumo developing on the left. See the tracheal deviation?" Pharaoh looked, a beat. "Subtle." "Yeah." She reached for the needle decompression kit. "Not for long. I'll get Dr. Okafor." "No time." She was already gloved, already positioned. "Call him, tell him I'm proceeding. He can be on the phone." Pharaoh looked at her with an expression that contained, in very compressed form, everything about what had happened 3 days ago. The review, the supervised practice restriction, the legal affairs meeting, all of it. "You're on supervised protocol," he said. "Careful. Not accusatory." "I know." She pressed the heel of her hand against Hamada's chest, feeling the position. "Call Okafor." Pharaoh reached for the phone. She heard him get through, heard him relay the situation in quick, clean language, heard the word Weston, and then a pause, and then Okafor's voice, tinny through the phone speaker. "Let her work. I'm here." She decompressed the tension pneumo. The improvement was immediate, not dramatic, not cinematic, just the quiet, functional shift of a system returning to something closer to equilibrium. Hamada's O2 began climbing back through the 80s.
His breathing lost the particular labored quality that meant the mediastinum was shifting and pulling everything wrong. Pharaoh looked at the monitor, then at her, then said nothing, which was the right call. "Chest tube next," she said. "And get me a vent consult. He's going to need support." The second wave came in at 8:47, and this was when the day stopped being manageable and became something else. 9 more patients, but 2 of them were surgical emergencies that overwhelmed the 2 available trauma surgeons simultaneously. And the ER's capacity hit a threshold that Dara flagged on the board in the way she flagged things when she needed everyone to understand that they were now operating in resource scarcity mode. Different math, different priorities, every decision measured against a finite pool of people and equipment and time. Mara moved between bays without thinking about it, the way she used to move between positions on a forward surgical station, reading the room constantly, identifying where the next failure point was going to develop before it did, positioning herself accordingly. Bay 2, a burns case that needed central line access. She put it in while the attending finished with the more critical airway case in Bay 5. Bay 7, a fragment wound to the right axilla that had an arterial bleed the first tech had missed because it was small and positioned in a fold of tissue that hid it until the blood pressure compensated down far enough to show the source. She found it by feel and held direct pressure for 8 minutes while waiting for the vascular team. Bay 4, a patient who wasn't critical by any measurable metric, but who was in the specific neurological state that blast concussion sometimes produced, present, verbal, seemingly stable, and quietly shutting down from the inside in a way that didn't show on the surface until it did, suddenly and catastrophically. She caught it from the way he was tracking the room, and she put him on continuous cardiac monitoring and pushed for a nurse surgical consult that didn't get taken seriously until she said, flat and without drama, "His pressure's been dropping 2 points every 4 minutes for the last 16 minutes, and I need someone to look at his head scan in the next 10 or we're going to have a different kind of problem." Neurosurgery looked, found a slow subdural bleed, took him to the OR. She didn't have time to feel anything about any of it. Wasn't. It was 11 a.m. when things stabilized enough for anyone to breathe. The ER looked like a building that had been used hard. Supply wrappers on the floor, blood on the linoleum in 3 bays, equipment stacked in configurations that made sense at 9 in the morning and didn't make as much sense now. The staff were moving slower, the particular slow of adrenaline running out, and the body remembering that it had been upright since 6:30. Dara sat down on the edge of a desk with a water bottle and looked at Mara for a long moment. "You did 4 procedures today," Dara said, "while under supervised protocol. Okafor was on the phone for 2 of them. He was on the phone from the surgical suite." "That counts," Mara said. She knew it did, and also that it was a technicality, and that Sorrell's legal pad was going to have more items on it by the end of the week. "Halverson's going to hear about this by lunch," Dara said. "It wasn't a warning, just an observation." "I know." "Mara," Dara leaned forward slightly. "What's the play here? Because I'm watching you work and I know what I'm seeing, but the institution is going to build a case against you regardless of what I'm seeing, and you don't seem to be doing anything to defend yourself." Mara thought about Dreschler, about 48 hours, about an amended file and a man who'd spent 5 years operating from an incomplete version of events. "I'm working on it," she said. Her phone was buzzing. She looked at it. Not Dreschler, not Voss. A number she didn't recognize with a 571 area code, also Northern Virginia. She felt the specific attention of something she couldn't name. She stepped into the corridor and answered. "Weston." "Ms. Weston," male voice, male, older, measured, the voice of someone accustomed to choosing words with precision and getting paid for it. "My name is Garrett Farwell. I'm an investigative correspondent with the Harlow Register. I'm working on a story about the Kellerman-based gas line incident, and I'm also, separately, looking at something related to a military records amendment from 2019. A brief pause. "I've been given your name in connection with both." She went very still. "I'm not interested in talking to the press," she said. "I understand, but I think you should know that you're not the only one who's been given names in connection with both." His voice didn't change. "The person who gave me yours also mentioned a Rear Admiral Desmond Voss,
and an office within the Naval Inspector General's division that apparently opened a quiet inquiry 4 months ago into records handling practices from 2018 through 2021. Another pause, which suggests that whatever you're in the middle of right now, you're in the middle of something considerably larger than a personnel grievance. Mara looked at the corridor wall. White paint, scuff marks, a fire safety sign she'd walked past 1,000 times. "How did you get this number?" she said. "I can't tell you that." Then I can't help you." "That's fair," he said. "But Ms. Weston, before you hang up, I want to say one thing. There are people who are working very hard right now to ensure that this story gets written a specific way. In that version, you're a civilian nurse who violated protocol twice in 1 week and got lucky with the outcomes. That's the story that protects certain people." He let that land for a second. "I'm trying to write a different one, but I can only do that with the right information." She said nothing. "You don't have to talk to me today," Farwell said, "but if you change your mind, you have the number." He hung up. Mara stood in the corridor for a moment, then a nurse came through from behind her, excusing herself around a supply cart, and the corridor returned to being an ordinary corridor in an ordinary hospital in the middle of an ordinary morning, except nothing about it was ordinary anymore, and she knew it. She went home at 3, which was early for her, and found an envelope on her doorstep. Not unusual. Her building had a shared entry, and mail sometimes got left at individual doors when the package was too large for the slot. But this wasn't mail. No postage, no return address, just her name on the front in block letters that told her nothing about who'd written them. She stood in her doorway and looked at it for long enough that her neighbor Mr. Pack opened his door to check if she was all right, and she told him she was. And she waited until he'd gone back inside before she picked it up. Inside was a single page, printed, not handwritten. 4 paragraphs of dense text with a classification header that she recognized immediately. The header format from the Forward Surgical Unit's operation reports, the specific layout of the 75th Support Brigade's documentation system. It was the first page of Aldrich Neves's supplementary report, the one Dreschler had mentioned, the one that had been reclassified and buried. And at the bottom, in handwriting, in ink, "There are 3 more pages. Meet me at the Grey Cup at 6. Come alone. A.N. Neves." He was in Harlow. She read the page 3 times, the words blurring slightly on the second pass, not because of the light, but because of what they said. The precise clinical language of a military after-action report describing in sequence the events of October 14th, 2019, including the moment at approximately 0340 hours when Captain Miles Rafferty had given Sergeant Stanhope a verbal order, and she had confirmed receipt and executed it while Corpsman Neves observed and documented the exchange. Her hands were shaking again, not from fear this time, from something that felt like 5 years of held breath starting, very slowly, to release. She was still standing in her doorway when her phone rang. Dreschler. "Ms. Weston," Dreschler said immediately before Mara could speak, "I need you to listen carefully. The amended Kandahar file has been accessed in the last 6 hours from 2 separate external terminals, which means someone else knows we've been looking at it. We are moving the timeline up. I need to know your location and whether you've been in contact with anyone connected to the original operation." Mara looked at the page in her hand. "Define connected," she said. A pause. "Ms. Weston, has Aldrich Neves contacted you?" The name hit the air between them like something physical. "Why?" Mara said carefully. "Because Corpsman Neves went AWOL from a VA treatment facility in Richmond 3 days ago," Dreschler said, "and the last cell signal we have for him puts him in Harlow as of this morning." Mara looked at the handwriting at the bottom of the page. The Grey Cup at 6. The familiar abbreviation, AN, the same initials on the duty roster she'd memorized for 6 months before the operation. "And that concerns you," Mara said. "It concerns me because Neves is the primary witness whose testimony would change the official record," Dreschler said. "And people who hold that position have a history, in cases like this, of becoming difficult to reach." The words landed carefully enough that their full weight took a second to settle. "You think he's in danger," Mara said. "I think someone else knows he's in Harlow," Dreschler said. And I think if you know where he is, you need to tell me right now. Mara looked at the page in her hand. The gray cup at 6. 3 more pages. She thought about a man from Louisiana with shrapnel in his shoulder, 22 years old, working IV lines in the dark because there was nobody else. And she thought about the fact that he had written down what he'd seen and someone had buried it, and now he was in her city and someone else was looking for him. I need an hour, she said. Miss Weston, 1 hour, she said. I'll call you back. She went inside, locked the door, and sat at her kitchen table with the page in front of her and the photograph still face down on the shelf, and the particular knowledge that whatever she decided in the next 60 minutes was going to determine whether the last 5 years of her life had meant anything at all. The hour she'd promised Dreschler she spent doing 3 things. First, she photographed the page with her phone, front and back, close enough to read every word, saved to an encrypted folder she'd set up 2 years ago for reasons she'd told herself were paranoid and now understood were not. Second, she called Dara, not to explain everything but to say enough, that something from her past had surfaced, that it was going to become visible in ways she couldn't fully control, and that Dara should know before it did. Dara listened without interrupting and then said, okay, in the way she said things when she was already 3 steps ahead in her thinking. Third, Mara put on a different coat, darker, with a hood, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for about 4 seconds before deciding that she was going to the gray cup at 6, regardless of what Dreschler said, because Aldrich Neves had been 22 years old and full of shrapnel, and he had written down the truth and someone had buried it, and she was not going to let him become unreachable in a city she'd been living in for 5 years while she sat at her kitchen table deciding to be careful. She called Dreschler at 4:15. He contacted me, she said. He left a note. He wants to meet at 6. Where? She told her. Then she said, I'm going. A pause. Ms. Weston, if there are hostile parties who are aware of Neves's location, then he shouldn't be sitting there alone, Mara said. I'll have my phone on. I'll check in every 30 minutes, but I'm going. Another pause, longer. There will be people in the area, Dreschler said finally. You won't see them. Don't look for them. I know how it works, Mara said, and hung up. But the gray cup was on the corner of Meridian and Orchard, a narrow 2-story building that had been a hardware store in a previous life and still had the original pressed tin ceiling and the wide plank floors that sloped slightly toward the back. The coffee was good, and the lighting was the kind of low that made everyone look like they were keeping a secret, which in the context of the evening felt almost funny. She got there at 10 to 6 and took a table near the back wall where she could see both entrances. Old habit. She ordered something she wasn't going to drink and watched the door. He came in at 5:58. She would not have recognized him on the street. 5 years and whatever he'd been through in them had changed the architecture of his face. Thinner through the jaw, older in the eyes, with the particular quality of someone who'd been in pain long enough that it had become structural, part of how he held himself. He was in civilian clothes, a worn jacket, a knit cap he pulled off as he came inside, and he scanned the room in the same automatic way she had. Not conspicuous, just a person looking for someone they were supposed to meet. He found her and stopped. She raised a hand. He came over. Weston, he said. He sat down across from her and put a manila envelope on the table between them and didn't move it toward her, just left it there like an object they both needed to decide what to do with. Neves. She looked at him. You look rough. Yeah. He almost smiled. So do you, a little. Long week. She looked at the envelope. You really wrote a supplementary report. I wrote it 3 days after the extraction, he said. I didn't tell anyone except the unit chaplain, who submitted it through official channels. He stopped. I only found out it had been reclassified 8 months ago. I was going through my VA paperwork, and something didn't match up with what I remembered submitting. Took me 4 months to figure out what had happened to it. Who reclassified it? He pressed his lips together. That's in the envelope. She looked at him steadily. Tell me first. He picked at the edge of the table, a small nervous gesture, almost young-looking, at odds with the rest of him. There was a lieutenant colonel at the time, Garrison Price. He was the administrative head of the 75th Support Brigade's Records and Documentation Office. He had access to the filing system, the authority level required to reclassify rather than redact. And he paused. And he had a relationship with Admiral Voss that went back a long time. They served together in the early 2000s. I don't know if Voss asked him to do it or if Price did it because he thought Voss would want it done. What I know is that the classification was applied 6 weeks after your discharge, and it was applied by Price's credentials. Mara sat with that for a moment. "Where's Price now?" she said. "Currently the Deputy Director of Records Management for the Naval Inspector General's office," Neves said, "which is why this has been difficult to move through official channels." Outside, Meridian Street was doing its ordinary evening things. Cars passing, a couple walking a large dog that was trying to investigate everything on the sidewalk, the coffee shop's window fogging at the edges from the warmth inside. Nothing that looked like surveillance. She wasn't going to assume that meant anything. "Dreschler knows you're here," she said. Neves nodded. "I know. I reached out to her first, actually, 2 months ago. She's the one who told me about you, that you were in Harlow." He looked at her directly. "I wanted to find you before I went through any more official channels, because the official channels are how this got buried in the first place." She pulled the envelope toward her and opened it. 3 more pages, as promised. The supplementary report was dated October 17, 2019, 3 days after the extraction, as Neves had said. It was written in the flat, detailed language of military documentation, and she read it the way she'd read everything from that period, carefully, looking for the places where it matched what she remembered and the places where it didn't. It matched. All of it matched, with the specificity of someone who had been physically present and paying attention. The timeline, the supply inventory, the 4 soldiers who were transportable, Rafferty's status at 0318 hours, declining but coherent, the verbal exchange at 0340, Rafferty giving the order, Mara confirming, Neves within arm's reach recording the exchange in his personal duty log. The subsequent triage decision that allocated the remaining morphine and the 2 functional IV lines to the soldiers with survivable injuries per Rafferty's direct order, because Rafferty had assessed his own injuries and made the calculation himself. Neves had written, Captain Rafferty was fully aware of the decision's implications. He gave the order clearly and without coercion. Sergeant Stanhope confirmed receipt and requested clarification once, which the captain provided. This was a command decision made by the ranking officer present. Sergeant Stanhope executed it. She set the pages down. She'd read the words. They were exactly what she'd known the truth was for 5 years. Reading them didn't feel like revelation. It felt like finally putting down something very heavy that she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to carry it. "He never told Voss," she said. Not a question. "No, he made you promise not to tell anyone." Neves's voice was careful. "I heard that part too. He said something like, I don't want this to be about me being a hero. I want to be the officer who made the call, and I need you to let it be that." She looked at the table. He knew Voss would try to make it a story. He knew Voss would try to make it a story with a villain, Neves said, and he didn't want that. "Well," she said quietly, "he got it anyway." Neves didn't say anything to that, which was right, because there wasn't anything to say. She gathered the pages back into the envelope. "I have someone who needs to see this tonight." Dreschler. "Her, yes. And someone else." She paused. "Voss." Neves looked at her. "You trust him with it?" "No," she said honestly. "But it's his." She called Dreschler from the sidewalk outside while Neves waited inside with a coffee he was actually drinking. The street was cold enough that her breath showed, and she walked half a block in each direction while she talked, the way she'd learned to do when a call was sensitive, and she needed to be sure of the space around her. Dreschler listened to the summary without interrupting and then said, "We need originals." "You'll have them. I'm also going to contact Admiral Voss tonight. I'm not asking permission." A pause. "If you do that before we've had a chance to build the formal case against Price." "If I don't do it tonight, someone else tells him first," Mara said, "and the version someone else tells him is either incomplete or designed to protect Price. He needs the full story from a primary source while he still has enough room to react to it correctly. Drechsler was quiet for a moment. You're asking him to turn on someone he's known for 25 years. I'm asking him to look at what that person did, Mara said. What he does with it is his business. Another pause, longer. All right, Drechsler said. Send me the photographs tonight. I'm beginning formal proceedings against Price in the morning. Whatever happens with Voss, make sure he understands that this goes through official channels from here. He can't go directly at Price. Understood. She went back inside and told Neves the plan, which he took in with the quiet of someone who had been sitting with this for months and was relieved to be moving, finally, even if moving was frightening. Where are you staying? She asked. He named a motel near the interstate. Don't stay there tonight, she said. You have any money? He shrugged. Some. She gave him the name of a different hotel, downtown, paid by the night, and the name of a contact at Drechsler's office he could call if he needed to reach someone before morning. Then she left the Grey Cup and got in her car and called the number Dara had relayed from the Admiral. He picked up on the second ring. Weston. I know who amended the file and why, she said. And I have Nevis's report, all 4 pages. Are you at the hospital? A silence. I can be in 20 minutes. The family consultation room on the 2nd floor of the CICU, she said. 20 minutes. Months. She got there first and sat in one of the uncomfortable chairs under the fluorescent light and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she'd developed as a teenager and refined under circumstances that made teenage problems look like practice. He came in at 8:04. He looked worse than he had that afternoon. The sleeplessness had accumulated, and his face had the quality of someone who had been thinking hard about a specific thing for a long time and hadn't reached anything that felt like solid ground. She put the envelope on the table. He looked at it, but didn't take it. Who? Garrison Price, she said. Lieutenant Colonel at the time, currently in the Inspector General's office. Something crossed his face. Recognition, then something that was harder to read. The expression of a man updating a map he's been reading for a long time. Price? He said quietly. He wasn't surprised exactly, more like confirmed. You already suspected him, she said. I suspected someone. He sat down across from her. Price had always been particular about Miles, very particular. They didn't have a good history by the end. I never fully understood it. He looked at the envelope. Is this Neves's report? All of it. Read it. He read it, all the way through, slowly, without saying anything. She watched him read it the way she'd sometimes watched patients come back from a diagnosis. Not for her own satisfaction, just because it mattered that she witnessed it. A few things moved across his face, and he controlled all of them, which was what she'd expected. He was too disciplined to come apart in front of someone he'd treated as an adversary for 5 years. Regardless of what the pages were telling him. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked at the table for a moment. He ordered it, he said. It came out flat, almost empty, the voice of someone from whom a significant structural element had just been removed. Yes. And Price used his access to make sure you never saw the section of the record that would have told you that. She kept her voice even. I don't know if he did it to protect your grief from something more complicated, or to protect himself from being connected to a records anomaly, or something else. That's for the investigation to determine. Voss set the pages down. He looked like he'd aged in the last 10 minutes, not dramatically, not in any way she could have pointed to specifically, but in the way that people age when something they've been certain about stops being certain. I drove you out, he said. I used my rank and my connections, and I made your career disappear. Yes. Because I believed, you believed what the incomplete record told you. She wasn't absolving him. That wasn't the point. But she was being accurate. You also believed it because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that Miles made a decision, and the decision cost him his life, and he did it deliberately, and there was nothing anyone could have done to change it. That's harder to carry than a person to blame. He looked at her directly. For the first time since the night in the ER, there was nothing in his face that resembled the controlled aggression of a man managing a threat. He just looked tired and old, and for a moment, very human. I don't know what to say to you, he said. You don't need to say anything to me tonight, she said. What you need to do is contact the Inspector General's office in the morning. Dreschler's name. She's JAG Corps. She's been building the formal case. Price needs to be removed from his position before he becomes aware that the investigation is moving. I can make that call tonight. Then make it. She stood. And I need you to appear at the credentials review hearing Thursday. Halverson's committee. He looked up. What I did Sunday night and what I did today during the Kellerman response. I made the right calls, she said. I need someone with authority to say that in a room where it counts, or the institution is going to make an example of me and protect itself and move on. That's how it works, and you know it. He nodded slowly. I'll be there. She picked up her coat. At the door, she stopped. He talked about you, she said. Miles. Not a lot, but sometimes. He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever met, and that was the only reason he put up with you for 30 years. She paused. He was proud of you. He told me that once. I thought you should know that. She left before he could say anything, which was the right call, because there was nothing to follow that wouldn't have diminished it. The credentials review hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m. in the Halversons' conference room, and Mara spent Wednesday doing her job, a full shift, supervised per protocol, with a physician present or on call for everything she touched. She did her job exactly as she always did it, and she did not make a single move that gave anyone an additional argument. Not because she was afraid of what would happen, but because precision was a form of respect, and she respected the thing she was fighting to keep. Dreschler called Wednesday afternoon with an update. Price had been placed on administrative hold pending investigation, which meant he had been contacted by the IG's office and was now aware the file anomaly had been discovered and was now, presumably, doing the things people in his position did when they understood that the ground under them had turned unreliable. Dreschler said this in the measured language of someone who had done this before, who knew how it went, and who was already 3 steps ahead. He'll cooperate or he won't, Dreschler said. Either way, the record is corrected. The amended classification is being reversed. The complete file will be the official file by end of week. Will it reach Halverson's committee by Thursday morning? Mara said. It will if Admiral Voss asks the right people tonight, Dreschler said. Which I understand he's doing. Mara absorbed that. Okay. Miss Weston. A pause. For what it's worth, what you did in that ER Sunday night and what you did during the Kellerman response. I've seen the incident reports. I've been doing this long enough that I can tell the difference between someone who got lucky and someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I know what I was doing, Mara said. I know, Dreschler said. That's what I'm saying. Thursday morning was gray and cold, the kind of November that settled into a city like a permanent resident. Mara drove to the hospital at 9:30, parked in the garage, and sat in her car for 3 minutes doing nothing before she went inside. The conference room held 8 people, Halverson at the head, Sorrell from Legal Affairs, 2 members of the Credentials Committee she knew by face but not well, an HR representative, and a physician advocate who was there in theory to represent her interests and who she had spoken to once on the phone and found professionally thorough but not particularly energetic. She was the 9th. She sat down, set her hands flat on the table, and waited. Halverson began. The procedural violations as documented, the specific protocol sections that applied, the risk exposure to the institution. Sorrell added the legal framing with the precision of someone who had written it out the night before and was reading from memory. The committee members asked clarifying questions. Mara answered everything directly, without qualification, without minimizing. Yes, she had performed the procedures. Yes, she had been aware of the supervised protocol status. Yes, she would do it again. No, she was not going to represent those decisions as mistakes. It was 10:24 when the door opened. Halverson looked up with the expression of someone who had arranged his morning carefully and was now watching the arrangement change without warning. Rear Admiral Desmond Voss walked into the conference room in full dress uniform. Behind him came a woman Mara recognized after a half-second as Dreschler, composed, dark suit, carrying a leather document case. And behind Dreschler came a man Mara did not recognize, but who had the bearing and the lanyard of someone from a government office that answered to no one in this building. Halverson stood up. Admiral. I apologize for the interruption, Voss said. He did not sound particularly apologetic. He sounded like a man who had slept 4 hours and made 12 calls and arrived at a conclusion and was now executing on it. I'll be brief. He set a folder on the table, thick, tabbed, with a cover sheet Mara could see from across the table bore the Naval Inspector General's letterhead. The nurse practitioner under review today is the subject of an active military records correction. The complete record of her service, including a classified witness report that was improperly reclassified in 2019, is being restored to the official file. The individual responsible for that reclassification has been removed from his position as of this morning, pending formal investigation. The room was very quiet. Miss Weston served as a combat medical specialist with the 75th Support Brigade's Forward Surgical Element for 4 years, Voss continued. She holds a combat action distinction and 3 commendations for medical performance under fire. The procedures she performed in this hospital this week were consistent with her documented capabilities and, more relevantly, consistent with the only clinically sound course of action available given the time constraints of each situation. He paused. I'll answer questions from the committee if there are any, but I want to be clear that my presence here is not pressure or interference. It is testimony, and I will give it under whatever formal process you prefer. Halverson looked at Sorrel. Sorrel looked at the folder. The folder sat on the table like an object that had changed the gravitational field of the room. The committee member on Halverson's left, a cardiologist named Feinberg, whom Mara knew slightly from an elevator conversation 2 years ago, picked up the folder and opened it. He read for about 45 seconds. Then he set it back down with an expression that was not quite anything she could name, the expression of someone who has been looking at a situation from one angle and has just been handed a view from a different direction. Dr. Halverson, Feinberg said, I'd like to request a short recess. The recess lasted 18 minutes. When they came back, Halverson looked at Mara with the expression of a man who is recalibrating in real time and is experienced enough to do it without making it about his own discomfort. The committee is going to need several days to review the full record before concluding the formal proceeding, he said. In the meantime, the supervised protocol restriction is lifted, effective today. He paused. And I want to say, for the record, the outcomes you achieved this week were significant. The process matters. But so does that. Mara looked at him. She didn't say thank you, because it wasn't that kind of moment. She nodded, which was enough. After the room cleared, she was in the hallway gathering her coat when Voss appeared beside her. He was still in full-dress uniform, which looked slightly out of place in a hospital corridor, but he didn't seem to notice or care. Price resigned this morning, he said. Before the formal notice came through, he knew it was coming. Will he face charges? She said. Dreschler thinks so. Records falsification at minimum. There may be more. They're still looking at what else went through his office during that period. He paused. His legal counsel is already attempting to negotiate a cooperation framework, which tells you something about how much else there might be. Mara thought about a man she'd never met making a decision in an office 5 years ago that had cost her a career and a name and 5 years of a life she'd had to rebuild from scratch. She didn't feel what she expected to feel about it, which was nothing dramatic, just a kind of tired relief, the emotional equivalent of a bruise that had finally been acknowledged. Garrett's being discharged Friday, Voss said. He wants to come by the ER. I told him you'd probably tell him there's nothing to come by for. There isn't, she said. I know. He was quiet for a moment. He said to tell you, and I'm quoting, that the nurse with the scary hand saved his life, and he's going to think about that for a very long time. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Tell him to eat well and not do any high-impact training for at least 8 weeks. Voss nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, something real, something it had cost him to get to. And then his phone buzzed, and he looked at it, and the moment closed. There's a formal recognition process, he said, for military personnel with commendations that weren't properly entered in the official record. Dreschler's office is initiating it. Your original commendations will be restored, and there's a distinction from the Kellerman response they're considering recommending you for. She looked at him. I know you don't want it, he said, but I'm telling you so you know it's happening. All right, she said.
He started to go, then stopped, his back half turned. "You said he was proud of me," he said. "Miles." "He was." He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man absorbing something he can't entirely manage right now but intends to carry with him. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me that." He walked down the corridor and she watched him go, and the hallway returned to being a hallway. She put her coat on, took a breath, and went back to work. She was 3 steps from the elevator when her phone buzzed. An internal message from Marcus. "Bay 3 needs you. Incoming critical. ETA. 4 minutes." She changed direction without breaking stride, moving toward the ER the way she always moved. Efficiently, without friction, finding the path of least resistance, not because she was passive, but because she always knew exactly where she needed to be. She pushed through the doors into the emergency department, and someone handed her a chart, and Marcus said, "Tension pneumo, young female, 22, bicycle accident." And she looked at the chart and then looked up at the bay where the gurney was coming through and said, "Let's go." And the room moved with her.
It was not until later, much later, near the end of a shift that ran long because they always ran long, that she stood at the staff locker room mirror and looked at herself and recognized, without drama and without particular ceremony, that the woman looking back at her was the same woman who had driven west 5 years ago until Harlow felt like far enough, and that she was still standing, and that this was not a small thing. She turned off the light and went home. But in the morning she came back, which was the only answer that had ever mattered. The days after the hearing didn't feel like victory. That was the thing nobody told you about being vindicated. It didn't arrive with the weight and clarity you'd imagined it would during the years you spent waiting for it. It arrived quietly, in the middle of ordinary things, and it felt less like triumph than like a low-grade fever finally breaking. You noticed its absence more than its presence. The particular tightness in your chest when you walked through certain doors, the automatic calculation you ran every morning about what the day might cost you. Those things began to ease, gradually, the way chronic pain eases when you've been living with it so long that you'd stop noticing it was there until the moment it wasn't. Mara noticed it for the first time on the Friday morning after the hearing, driving to the hospital in the gray November light, when she realized she wasn't rehearsing contingencies. She was just driving. It was a small thing. It meant a great deal. The formal restoration of her military record took 11 days from the date of Dreschler's filing. Bureaucratic processes moved at their own speed, indifferent to the emotional significance of what they were processing, and Mara had enough experience with institutions to not take the pace personally. She received an official letter on a Tuesday. Standard government envelope, standard formatting, the language so neutral and procedural that the weight of what it actually contained was almost invisible inside it. Her commendations were restored. The classified sections of the Kandahar extraction file were declassified and incorporated into the permanent record. The amended classification applied in 2019 was officially characterized as an unauthorized alteration of military documentation, which was the bureaucratic language for what everyone who'd read the file now understood it to be. She read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept important documents: the apartment lease, her nursing license renewal, the car registration. Ordinary things. It felt right that the letter lived there with the ordinary things. It was part of her life now, not separate from it. The photograph on the kitchen shelf she turned face up again that evening. Not as a ceremony, just because it had been face down long enough. Garrison Price's resignation became public knowledge on the same Tuesday. It appeared first as a brief item in a defense policy newsletter that Mara would never have read if Dreschler hadn't forwarded it. 3 paragraphs noting that the Deputy Director of Records Management for the Naval Inspector General's office had stepped down citing personal reasons, with a pending review of administrative practices in his division. The language was careful and said almost nothing, the way language in those publications was always careful, and said almost nothing when what it was actually describing was a man whose position had become untenable because the thing he'd done had been found. The fuller accounting came 2 weeks later, when the IG's formal report was released, not publicly, but through the channels that fed journalists who covered military affairs, and Garrett Farwell at the Harlow Register had clearly been one of them. His piece ran on a Thursday. Mara read it on her phone during a break, standing at the staff locker room sink with her coffee going cold on the counter. Farwell was a good writer in the specific way that mattered for this kind of story. He didn't editorialize, he didn't reach for dramatic language, he just laid out the sequence of events in order and let the sequence speak for itself. The unauthorized reclassification. The 5-year gap during which the official record had been functionally incomplete. The effect of that gap on the military career of a decorated forward surgical specialist. The investigation that had been quietly opened 4 months earlier by a JAG Corps attorney who had noticed a discrepancy in cross-reference documents from a separate case. He didn't name Mara. She had told him, in the one conversation they'd had after the hearing, that she didn't want to be named. He'd respected it without pushing, which told her something about him. He did name Price. Clearly, with full context, with the specific language of the IG report that characterized the reclassification as an intentional act rather than an administrative error. Price had cooperated with the investigation in exchange for an agreement that reduced his formal legal exposure. But cooperation hadn't made the finding disappear. It had only made it comprehensive. The IG's report documented not just the 2019 reclassification, but 2 other instances of records handling irregularities during Price's tenure, neither of which had been investigated at the time because nobody had been looking. He would not face criminal charges for the reclassification itself, which Dreschler had explained to Mara in advance, in the level-voiced way she explained things that were unsatisfying but accurate. The legal threshold for criminal records falsification in this context was specific, and the cooperation agreement had been a calculated trade that served the broader investigation. He had, however, been stripped of his clearance, his pension was under review pending the outcome of the additional findings, and he was, at 57 years old, finished in any role that required access to classified material, which was most of the roles he was qualified for. It was not everything. Mara was honest with herself about that. There were 5 years she didn't get back, a career she'd rebuilt from scratch in a different city under a name that was technically hers, but had always felt like a borrowed identity. Those years had cost her things she hadn't fully cataloged because cataloging them hadn't seemed useful. But Price had done the thing in the dark, believing it would stay there, and it had not stayed there, and he had been made to stand in the light with it. That was real. That was something. She finished her coffee, rinsed the mug, and went back to work. Garrett Voss came to the hospital on the second Friday of December. He looked better than he had in the CICU. The color was fully back, and he'd put some weight on, and he moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had learned, through direct experience, not to take physical capability for granted. He was in civilian clothes, which somehow made him look younger than the uniform would have, and he had a small potted plant under one arm that he held with the self-conscious expression of a person who had decided on a gesture and was now slightly uncertain about it. Dara spotted him at the desk before Mara did. "There's a very large man at the nurse's station with what appears to be a succulent," she said. Mara looked up. Something shifted in her chest. Not sentiment exactly, more like the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been left incomplete becoming complete. She walked out to meet him. He extended the plant. "I asked the nurse at the front desk what you'd want, and she said you'd probably say nothing, so I got you something you'd have to keep alive," he said. Seemed appropriate. "A succulent," she said. "They're hard to kill." "They're really not," she said, but she took it. He looked at her with the straightforward eyes she'd noticed in the CICU, not his father's assessing quality, just someone looking at someone else and meaning it. "I don't have a speech," he said. "I tried writing one and it was terrible." "Good call. I just wanted to—" He paused. "I wanted to come here and be standing in front of you so that you could see that I was standing." He said it simply, without drama. "That's the whole thing." She looked at him for a moment. A 26-year-old who had been 2 minutes from dying in a trauma bay and was now standing in a hospital corridor holding a door open against the December cold that was coming in from the entrance behind him, earnest and slightly awkward and entirely alive. "I see it," she said. He nodded. Then, "My dad wanted me to tell you." The formal recognition from the Kellerman response. "He said to tell you that you don't have to attend the ceremony, but that the distinction is going through regardless, and he wanted you to know it's not something you can decline." "Can I not decline it?" He said no. A small grin. "He also said, and I'm quoting, that you'd argue about it, And I should tell you that the argument was already lost. She looked at the succulent in her hand. Fine. Fine is a word he said you'd use. Your father is irritating, she said. Yeah. Garrett's grin settled into something warmer and less guarded. He's working on it. She walked him out to the entrance, and he shook her hand at the door. A firm, two-handed shake, the kind that meant something. And then he went back to the business of recovering, and she went back to the ER, and the succulent went on the shelf above the staff locker room sink where there was a window and enough light. The formal recognition ceremony was held on a Thursday morning at Kellerman Naval Base, in a room that smelled like institutional carpet and had photographs of warships on the walls and chairs that were slightly too close together. It was smaller than she'd expected, 12 people, maybe 15, and Voss had clearly organized it to be low-key, which she understood was his version of respecting her preference for not being in the center of a room. Dreschler was there. Neves was there, which she hadn't expected. He'd cleaned up and had a new jacket, and looked like someone who'd been sleeping better, which she hoped was true. Dara was there because Voss had apparently called Halverson, who had called Dara, which was a chain of events Mara would have stopped if she'd known about it in advance. She was glad, standing there, that she hadn't known. Halverson himself was in the back row. He caught her eye when she looked over and gave her the small nod of a man who was acknowledging something without making a production of it, which was the right register, and she respected him slightly more for knowing the right register. The commendation language was read aloud by an officer she didn't know. The Kandahar citation, the one that had been in the record and then not in the record and was now in the record again, was read first. Then the Kellerman citation, which had been formally processed in the 2 weeks since the Harlow incident. They were military documents, which meant they were precise and procedural and communicated enormous things in language that was deliberately impersonal, and she found that she preferred it that way. Voss pinned the distinction himself. He stood in front of her and pinned it to the lapel of the jacket she'd bought specifically for this occasion, and he did it with the focus and precision of a man who wanted to do it correctly, and then he stepped back and looked at her. "There's something I should have said a long time ago," he said. He said it quietly enough that it was effectively private inside a room full of people, which she thought was intentional. "I was wrong about you. Not just about what happened in Kandahar. I was wrong about the kind of person you are. I knew Miles for 30 years, and I thought I understood everyone he trusted, and I was wrong about that too." He paused. "I'm sorry for what I did to your career for the 5 years. I know there's nothing that I know it doesn't fix it, but I wanted to say it in a room with people, so that it wasn't something I said in a hospital hallway that nobody witnessed." She looked at him. She had thought about this moment, in the abstract, many times over 5 years. What she would say if she ever got the chance to say it, what the conversation would look like, whether she would be angry or cold, or whether she would say something precise and devastating that would make him understand the full weight of what those years had cost. She'd had the conversation in her head in 100 different versions. Standing in front of him now, she discovered that none of the versions were what she actually felt, because what she actually felt was not rage or satisfaction or even the release she'd expected. It was something quieter and more complicated. The recognition that a man who had been certain about something for 5 years had looked at the evidence and updated, and that this was genuinely difficult, and that the difficulty of it was not irrelevant. "I know it doesn't fix it," she said, "but I hear you." He nodded. That was enough. Mez. After the ceremony, there was coffee and the kind of food that appeared at institutional events. Sandwiches on a table, small cookies that were slightly stale, the gesture of hospitality without the execution of it. Mara ate a sandwich because she hadn't eaten breakfast and talked to Neves for 20 minutes in the corner of the room. He was going back to Louisiana. He had a sister there and a nephew who was 4 years old and apparently very interested in trucks, and a place in a VA residential program that actually seemed to be helping, which he told her with the careful optimism of someone who'd been disappointed by care systems before and was trying not to be this time. "The report," she said. "What you wrote. You held on to it for 5 years. He looked at his coffee. "I didn't know what to do with it. I was 22 and I'd been blown up and I wasn't doing great for a while. And by the time I was doing better, it felt like too much time had passed, Like whatever I said would just look like I was trying to revisit something everyone else had moved on from. He paused. And then I found out it had been classified, and I understood that someone had made a decision to bury it, and that changed it. That made it, I don't know. That made it something I had to do something about. It did, she said. You did. He looked at her. Did it help? Getting it back, the record? Did it actually help? She thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. It helped in a specific way, she said. It didn't make the 5 years not happen, but it means the story is right now. The official version of what happened is accurate. That matters more than I expected it to. He nodded slowly. Miles would have hated this whole thing, he said. The ceremony and the room and the sandwiches. She almost laughed. He really would have. He would have found somewhere to get bad coffee and sat there until it was over. And complained the whole way home, she said. They both were quiet for a moment, not sadly. Just the particular quiet of two people who had the same person in the same corner of their memory and were briefly visiting that corner together. Take care of yourself, she said. Actually. Working on it, he said. She believed him. Yes. December finished itself out, and January came in cold and businesslike, and Mara's life at Harlow Regional resumed the shape it had always had, with the difference that its shape was now accurate. Her credentials were clean. The supervised protocol restriction had been formally lifted. The record in the hospital system no longer said a nurse practitioner had committed 2 protocol violations in 1 week. It said a medical professional with specialized training had made 2 clinically sound decisions under time-critical conditions, which was what had actually happened. Halverson offered her a position on the hospital's Emergency Preparedness Committee, which was a committee that met monthly and reviewed mass casualty response protocols. And she said yes because the Kellerman response had shown her exactly the kind of gaps in Harlow Regional's system that someone with her background could actually address. It was not a grand gesture. It was a Tuesday morning email and a meeting request for the 2nd week of January. But it was the institution finding a more accurate use for what she actually was, and that was its own kind of recognition. Farwell, at the Harlow Register, reached out in January as well, asking if she'd be willing to speak on the record for a follow-up piece about civilian healthcare workers with military backgrounds and the gaps in how their training was utilized and credentialed. She said she'd think about it. She was still thinking about it, which meant she was going to say yes eventually, but on her own schedule. Betta Sorrell from Legal Affairs stopped her in the corridor one afternoon in late January, which Mara braced for without showing it, and said, stiffly, like the sentence had been rehearsed, that the legal team had concluded the outcomes from both incidents in November had been optimal given the circumstances and that the committee had determined no further administrative action was warranted. Then she walked away before Mara could say anything, which was probably just as well. The thing about being underestimated. The thing Mara had time to think about now that she wasn't spending her mental energy on managing the consequences of it, was that it was almost never about the person being underestimated. It was about the person doing the estimating, and what they needed the world to look like in order to make sense of their place in it. Halverson had needed the institution to be protected. Sorrell had needed the liability contained. Price had needed the story of Kandahar to be the story that served Voss's grief, because Voss's grief was something Price could manage, and the alternative, a story that was more complicated, that asked more of everyone, was harder. Voss himself had needed a person to blame because the alternative was sitting with the full weight of what Miles Rafferty had chosen, and that weight had no exit, no resolution, nowhere to put it except onto someone else. None of them had looked at Mara Weston and thought about what she was. They'd looked at her and thought about what they needed her to be. She had spent 5 years being angry about that, in the low-grade chronic way that doesn't feel like anger because it's become too structural to feel like anything in particular. She wasn't angry anymore, which was not the same as saying it had been acceptable. It hadn't been. Several people had made decisions that were wrong, and some of them had made decisions that were deliberately wrong, and the consequences of those decisions had fallen on her, because consequences fall on whoever is standing downstream when the thing breaks. But she had stood downstream, and she had not been broken, and she had built something in Harlow that was hers, a practice, a reputation, a department that functioned better when she was in it, colleagues who trusted her, patients who were alive who might not have been. She had built that with the same hands that had once done the work on a forward operating base in the worst light you could imagine. And it was still the same work, and she was still the same person, and 5 years of erasure had not changed either of those things. That was the thing about being invisible. Sometimes you had to be invisible for a while before people were willing to look. On a Saturday in February, Mara drove out to the east end of the city where there was a stretch of reservoir trail that was mostly empty in the winter. She went there when she needed to think without the interference of needing to think, which was its own kind of skill. It was cold and clear, the sky the specific pale blue that February managed sometimes, and the water was flat and still, and she walked for an hour without talking to anyone and without looking at her phone and without planning anything except the next step in front of her. She thought about Miles Rafferty laughing at something off camera, the coffee cup in his hand, the light behind him. She thought about what Neves had said, that Miles would have found somewhere with bad coffee and sat there until the ceremony was over. And she felt the grief the way she occasionally let herself feel it, cleanly, without trying to redirect it. He had been a good officer and a decent man, and he had made a decision in the worst circumstances possible, and she had honored it at enormous personal cost, and she would make the same choice again, because that was the kind of person she was. And she had stopped being uncertain about that kind of person she was. She stopped at a bench near the water and sat for a while with her hands in her coat pockets. What she knew, sitting there, was this: that the years she'd spent building a life in Harlow were not wasted years, not detours from something more real that had been stolen from her. They were what she had made, in the circumstances she'd been handed, with the resources available to her. The ER at Harlow Regional was not a lesser version of the forward surgical element she'd left. It was a different version of the same thing: people in crisis, in pain, in need of someone who knew what they were doing. And she was that person. And she had been that person all along, regardless of what anyone's file said about it. She was going to keep being that person. Not because anyone had recognized it now, not because the record was corrected and the distinction was pinned to a lapel, and a man in a uniform had said the words in a room with witnesses. Those things mattered. She wasn't going to pretend they didn't matter. But they weren't the reason. The reason was the same as it had always been, before Kandahar, before Price, before Voss, before Harlow. It was the only reason that had ever survived everything else falling away. She knew how to help people. She was good at it, and she intended to keep doing it. That was all. That was enough. She was back at the hospital by noon. Marcus was at the desk when she came through, reviewing something on the board. He looked up and said, "We've got a pediatric respiratory coming in around 12:30. Kid's 9, asthma exacerbation, apparently not responding well to the pre-hospital treatment." "What did they give her?" Mara said, shrugging off her coat. 2 rounds of albuterol nebulizer, O2 sats hovering around 91. "Magnesium sulfate ready?" "Pulling it now." She tied her gloves. "What bay?" 6. She walked toward bay 6 the way she always walked, without rushing, without hesitation, following the precise internal calculation of where she needed to be and how fast she needed to get there. The ER hummed around her with its ordinary machinery, the desk, the monitors, the particular frequency of a department that processed emergencies the way a body processed breath, continuously, without ceremony, because stopping was not an option. Behind her, Derek called from the nurse's station. "Weston, the board's full and Feinberg's stuck in consult until 1. "I know," Mara said, without turning around. "So you've got—" "I know," she said again. She pushed through into bay 6 and looked at the chart that Marcus handed her, and looked at the vitals on the board, and looked at the empty gurney where the patient would be in approximately 4 minutes. And she stood there a moment in the particular stillness that was not calm, but the thing underneath calm, the deep functional quiet of a person who had been through enough that nothing in this room could frighten her, and who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The ambulance bay doors opened. She went to meet them. The woman they'd underestimated had never needed them to see her clearly. She'd needed the work to be real, and it was. She'd needed the patients to be alive, and they were. She'd needed the truth to be somewhere in the record, even if she was the only one who knew where it was, and now it was in all the records, the right version, the complete version, the one that matched what had actually happened. The rest of it, the recognition, the ceremony, the restored distinction, the Admiral who had learned to be wrong, that wasn't the point. It had never been the point. The point was the work, and the work was continuing, and she was the one doing it. Not despite everything that had happened, because of the person she had remained through all of it, steady, precise, and impossible to erase.